Welcome to Writer's Block. I'm Lisa Page. My guests this edition are Eleanor Clift and Tom Brazaitis, authors of Without Bloodshed. Their book explores the political culture of the nation's capital and the interlocking relationships that control power. Eleanor Clift is a regular panelist of the McLaughlin Group and a contributing editor of Newsweek magazine. Tom Brazaitis is the Washington bureau chief of the Cleveland Plain Dealer and a columnist for that paper, and they are also husband and wife. Welcome to the Tacoma Coffee House.
Glad to be here, Lisa.
And thanks for coming. This book is a real overview of politics and how they work in detail. You guys explored so many positions of the political world, and I was wondering if you could talk about, you say in the introduction it's like George Will's idea about baseball to explore different positions of power, is that?
Well, George Will wrote a book called Men at Work, which was a description of the game of baseball, and he did it through the eyes of the men who played the key positions. And so we borrowed his conceit and we chose a half a dozen positions in politics and then looked at the men and women who are the best at what these jobs are.
And some of the people you chose and the positions were?
Yeah, the first thing we did was choose positions in politics to try to illustrate the game of politics from the inside. And we took a pollster for starts, because pollsters pretty much set the agenda in our politics today. We have lobbyists, two of them, and we reported during the time of the health care initiative on the part of the Clinton administration, so we follow that very closely. A committee chairman, the inscrutable Daniel Patrick Moynihan, somebody everybody's familiar with but nobody quite knows, and we try to get inside his head in this book. Newt Gingrich was our opposition leader to start, but by the time the book was ready to go to press, he was the Speaker of the House, and so we dealt with his rise to the speakership, how he did it. We have a member of Congress, Maxine Waters. She's one of 435, and I think although she's from California, many people outside California know of her, and that was our point in picking her, that she managed to get noticed. And finally, we took an important staff person, Sheila Burke, who was the chief of staff to Bob Dole when he was the minority leader of the Senate. And we showed how she, in fact, was at least as powerful as any of the junior senators. She was called the 101st senator, but she wields a lot of power, and so do a lot of staff members. And we try to illustrate that in the book.
And how did you get the idea to put this all together? I mean, what were you trying to do initially?
Well, the book was conceived shortly after Bill Clinton won election in 1992, and our idea, which seems rather naive now, was to write a book that would essentially be a celebration of politics, a celebration of the political arts, and we would document how this new piece of social legislation, health care reform, would wind its way through Congress. And so that's what we started out to document. The story, of course, had a very different ending. The legislation crashed and burned, and all the 8 people who we write about, played a role in advancing health care reform or killing it, depending on where they sat.
And in fact, Moynihan seemed to sort of not be one of the big supporters of that bill, and ultimately, that in the beginning he didn't think it was possible. Is that what you found?
Moynihan was a pragmatist. I mean, he knew the Senate, and he knew what the Senate would swallow. He knew what his own committee would swallow, and it was one of the more liberal committees in the Senate, more liberal than the Senate as a whole. And he frankly told the president, this bill is not going to fly in my committee, much less the Senate. But his advice was not heeded.
He also, though, could have played a role, I think, in shaping attitudes about this legislation, but he was critical about it from the start. And when the legislation arrived on Capitol Hill, all 1,342 pages of it, he would hold it aloft, and then he would let it drop to the floor with a loud thud and say, you could kill somebody with this. And so his attitude was negative. Now, if he had supported the Clintons from the start, I doubt that would have made the difference. But he did not help the cause.
And he's such an interesting figure because of how many years has he been around and working? 4 different presidents or something?
Started with Jack Kennedy.
Yes.
And he's worked for, is it 4 or 5 different presidents, Republicans and Democrats.
Right.
So,
right.
And he comes across like this intellectual who just stumbled onto the stage of politics, but he's quite crafty. And we close his chapter with an anecdote pointing out that this big new federal building that's going up on Pennsylvania Avenue is part of Moynihan's dream to rebuild Pennsylvania Avenue. When the Republicans won control in '94, he worried that they would halt construction because the building cost so much more and the Republicans were shrinking government.
Right.
And so Senator Moynihan went to his friend Senator Dole, and together they came up with the idea to name this building the Ronald Reagan Building. And no Republican will criticize anything with Ronald Reagan's name on it.
Oh, that's great. That's a great story.
For your viewers who are interested, by the way, the book is coming out in paperback this October. It's been a hardback. It's been out in hardback for a little while now and is still available, but the paperback edition will be published soon, and we've updated it to talk about where our characters are now. And we call the chapter Survivors because they're all good players of the game of politics, and in one way or another they've survived. Dole lost the election, but Sheila Burke, his chief of staff, wound up at Harvard in an important job there, and Stanley Greenberg was cut out at the White House, but he's still polling for the Democratic Committee. And all the players except Gingrich are on solid ground. As everyone knows, the Speaker of the House is constantly under attack from within his own Republican Party. And I think if you read the chapter on him, you'll know why. He practically destroyed the House in order to take control of it.
Yeah, would you talk a little bit about him, just in that chapter, in terms of what?
Yeah, the amazing thing about Gingrich is that we in the press thought he was kind of an off-the-wall character,
right.
And everybody liked to quote him, but nobody took him seriously. I mean, he said bombastic things, and he got
right.
his name mentioned a lot, but nobody ever thought of him as ever becoming Speaker of the House. But he was, meanwhile, using these other organizations that he to finance his operations, sending out tapes, sending out speeches, training people to run as Republican candidates around the country, and developing a network that eventually grew strong enough to overthrow 40 years of Democratic reign in the House. On the other hand, he was a revolutionary, and once he took control, everything he said was magnified 10,000 times, something he didn't really realize when he had the snit on Air Force One about riding in the back. He talked about that at a breakfast of reporters, and we've since talked to Tony Blankley about that breakfast. Eleanor?
Well, Tony Blankley said that Newt Gingrich's admission that he was in a snit because he didn't get to ride up front with President Clinton was the most destructive thing any politician had said, short of admitting a felonious act. His approval ratings went, down into the single digits. I mean, it was really very negative for him. But Newt Gingrich is actually a lot like Bill Clinton, and both these people think that if you let them talk long enough, they'll be able to convince you that they're right. They're both marathon talkers, and Newt Gingrich did grant us, access and did speak through many of his ideas to us, and we owe the title of the book to Gingrich, who quotes Mao Zedong, the founder of the People's Republic of China, in the expression saying, war is politics with bloodshed, politics is war without bloodshed.
And it's a great way to put it.
Right,
I mean, it really,
right.
Although when people think of Newt Gingrich, they say, what do you mean without bloodshed?
right. I mean, that's really true. You also have Maxine Waters in the book, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that chapter as well, and why you chose her. And
we chose her, as Tom said earlier. Even getting noticed when you're one of 435 is very difficult. Maxine Waters was an established politician by the time she got to Washington. She'd been Speaker of the House? No, she'd been high up in the hierarchy in California, working with Willie Brown. And then she comes to Washington and she finds herself a junior member of the Democratic caucus with all the rules and the rituals that are meant to keep junior members down. And she started out immediately, you know, breaking a little china. And if you go into her office, she has a little blue chair sitting on a shelf. And this is a symbol of the fact that when she went to a meeting of the Democratic caucus, the blue chairs are for the leaders, the brown chairs are for everybody else. Often the leaders wouldn't all show up. There'd be empty blue chairs and not enough brown chairs. So Maxine sat in a blue chair, created all kinds of waves, and she once said of former House Speaker Tom Foley, a very nice gentleman, but not a terribly effective speaker, that he was the kind of man who could spend all day telling you about the history of his desk. And so she rebelled against a lot of the rituals. And but yet, when we did our epilogue, we've pointed out that Maxine Waters now chairs the Black Caucus, and she's become part of the leadership herself, which imposes.
Talk about a survivor.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
I think if, as a citizen, if I wanted to get something done, if something as simple as an emergency passport or something as complicated as funding for a project, Maxine Waters is the one I'd want championing the cause, because she doesn't take no. She just turns it around and keeps coming back. We call the chapter knocking down the door, and that's exactly what she does.
And since this is a community program, I want to say one other thing about Maxine. She has this compelling personal story. She's the fourth of 13 children, and she grew up in a poor area of St. Louis, but there was a community center, and she could go there after school. And as she, you know, points out, I learned how to dance. I knew who Martha Graham was, and public school teachers who watched over her, who made sure she had clothes to wear, took her to outings on the weekend. She was raised by a community, and many of these community resources are lacking in our city neighborhoods now. And I think her story is a very good reminder of the benefits you get when you nurture kids and when you help families nurture kids.
Well, you also talk about her fighting for the cities in a time when politics is focusing on the suburbs more and more, and that was really, it really struck me how fierce she's had to be to go after all.
Well, the height of that was when the riots occurred in her district of Los Angeles after the Rodney King decision. There was a meeting at the White House to which many members of Congress were invited, but she was not. And this was George Bush's, to his regret, because she made sure that she got inside that meeting by, in effect, threatening Tom Foley, the Speaker of the House, to go public with her complaints in a very visible way if she weren't included, and she was there.
It's fascinating. You have a lot of things in the book doesn't focus on this, but there is a current of racial politics throughout. I mean, the Stanley Greenberg story, you've got it with Moynihan, you've got it with her. When she doesn't support Jesse Jackson, she's a pragmatist. She sees that Clinton can win, and you've got other anecdotes in there that I found fascinating in the fabric of politics that. You know, that this goes on, and the choices people make, that Al Sharpton was running against Moynihan.
Oh, that's a good point.
You know,
yeah, Al Sharpton was running in the primary against Senator Moynihan, and Liz Moynihan tried to get members of the Democratic National Committee to get Jesse Jackson to get Mario Cuomo to offer him a job somehow to get him out of the primary. And you know, the Democratic operatives said, you know, are you nuts? You know, this would be leaked in 30 seconds, and how would we look?
Could you see Al Sharpton getting up there with that?
And Stanley Greenberg, who always had an interest in racial issues in this country from the time he protested as a teenager, while he was polling for Clinton, was also flying halfway across the world to poll for Nelson Mandela, and doing that on a pro bono basis. And we title that chapter Throwing the Bones, because Nelson Mandela was suspicious of Western polling techniques, and he said at one point to Stan Greenberg, if your numbers aren't right, we can always get the witch doctor to throw the bones.
Yeah, that was great.
And then we had Newt Gingrich endorsing the Martin Luther King holiday back in his days in Georgia, playing. You know, he started as a Rockefeller Republican, Newt Gingrich did.
I didn't know that.
And he changed his politics to suit a district where he thought he might be able to win. And the rest is history, and now we all have him.
Isn't that, it's so interesting though. It's so interesting the shifts that you show in the book from, you know, in terms of character and decisions that are made. And I mean, the Moynihan thing of going back and forth between the Democratic and the Republican presidents is like an extreme version, but you've got a lot of that. I mean, that's...
Well, people make career decisions based on their own personal advancement, but also upon principle, upon opportunity. I mean, all of this stuff is much more complicated than it is when you just read about them in a paragraph in a newspaper.
Right. And your book really shows that. I mean, it's really there in terms of what's happening. We're just about out of time now. But I want to stress the paperback's coming out in the fall. So,
that's right.
So soon. Oh, that's good to know. And that'll be great to have that in bookstores.
Well, we hope to get college students interested and get into the college market. We think
it's a natural.
It's better than the traditional political books.
Absolutely. It's very to the point and very direct. And
you haven't asked us how we could write a book together and still stay married.
Oh yes. Well, when I have you on again, I'll have to ask you that question.
Okay.
So, once again, the name of the book is War Without Bloodshed. Thanks to authors Eleanor, Clift, and Tom Brazaitis for joining us. I'm Lisa Page, and this has been Writer's Block.
Next, poetry by Rose Solari. Then, Driving the World to the Brink, author Mark Hertsgaard on the car and its culture.
Hi, my name is Rose Solari, and I'm going to read a poem from a sequence of poems about my dad. This one is called Your Face. Still beautiful, and still the first best place I could ever call home. Your eyes at the end were not opaque, but simply elsewhere. It took me a while to realize this wasn't personal, that trying to call you back with anecdotes or books wasn't wrong, but silly. Like me as a child trying to flag down planes that flew over our backyard by waving my hands. You were more than ready. You'd been preparing yourself for years so that when whatever it was you saw in those last days walked into the room, your body would shed its names like water to fit its indifferent arms. Now my body feels as empty as yours must be. Organs removed, blood extracted, and the breath that carried your soul in words to me now vanished in air. Outside, birds sing their usual songs, water slides or trips or runs. Inexplicably, the world, without you, goes on. I could carry you everywhere, like a stone in my shoe, and still never see your face on this earth again.
Far more than even the personal computer, the automobile has fundamentally changed the way we live. Most people would probably say, for the better. If you need to go to the supermarket, just hop in the car. Rush the kids to the hospital, well, thank heavens for the car. To be sure, critics of the car culture abound. They blame the car for suburban sprawl, the breakup of neighborhoods and community, and for our reliance on petroleum, and for much of what's wrong with the air we breathe. Cohen, Mark Hertsgaard's next book is on the global environmental forecast, and he's with us tonight to discuss the automobile. Welcome to Tacoma Coffee House.
Thanks.
Does the car get a bum rap?
Well, you know, the interesting thing about the car is that it is, as you were pointing out, there's so much about it that's great. And that's why I think that humans have really become addicted to cars, you know, and you can't hardly blame them. They are irresistible. They're fast. They give us a kind of mobility that, you know, they are basically the magic carpet brought to life. It's like a 20th century version of the magic carpet. And when we first started to get involved with cars in the 1920s and so forth, you didn't understand all the consequences that were going to flow from that down the road in terms of safety problems and the environmental problems and so forth. So, you know, it's not, in terms of car critics, it's not like there was somebody set out to ruin the planet. And yet, if you were to pick a technology that could ruin the planet, you could hardly design a better one than the car, or at least the way that the car has come to be developed in terms of internal combustion engines and so forth. So, but that's what makes it tricky in terms of getting away from cars. It's very hard to break that addiction because it's not like cigarettes. You know, the cars give you something very valuable.
So should we try to break the addiction, or is there something less than that that we might be trying to do to accomplish the goals of protecting our future?
Well, I think it'd be very tough to break the addiction, although what's happening now, and we see it here in the issue that we're going to discuss a little bit tonight with this new outer beltway that they want to build outside Interstate 370, which I guess cuts across the northern part of Montgomery County. You know, the car becomes your master. It really is an addiction that comes to enslave you. And we have so many cars that we have to build more highways. And what you really learn is that all around the world now we're beginning to understand this, that building more highways is the worst answer, because as soon as you build them, they fill up. And that you have to do something to reduce the use of the car. And yes, I do think you have to, unless you're prepared to continue to see things go. And you know, congestion is just in some ways the most annoying or irritating thing. But
it's an aesthetic problem in some ways. I mean, is there a health problem?
Sure. There's on congestion, it's much the economic problem. There's $100 billion they estimate every year in lost productivity in this country from people who are sitting there in traffic jams. The average American commuter, I can say this because I'm not a commuter, they spend an average of 2 hours a week in a full-blown traffic jam. And beyond that, if you look, and anybody, you know, you can see this from your own knowledge, almost all the highways now are clogged.
Well, we can see some scenes of highways moving rather slowly. What we're going to look at is footage of the Beltway near the Mormon Temple before 5 o'clock in the afternoon. This is the traffic pattern before 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And the traffic's moving, but it's moving at an increasingly a snail's pace.
Is that what's on camera now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that immediately makes me think back to actually the chapter in my book about cars begins in Bangkok, where actually I know you've been as well. And the traffic jams there, I arrived there in the middle of the night at midnight, and it's about 15 miles in from the airport to the city, and it took us an hour and a half. This was at midnight. Bangkok has some of the worst traffic in the world, but this is pretty much the same in all the big cities in Asia and also in Europe now. Wonderful cities like London and Paris have been all but ruined by the car.
I think a lot of us think of the car as an American phenomenon, maybe because of the big fins in the 1950s, and it was probably instrumental in making what is called the American century.
Absolutely.
It's the industrial foundation of America's strength apart from the military, I suppose.
Yeah.
Now I guess we're actually seeing the outer belt, the beltway around the Mormon Temple.
Ah, okay. Well, that beltway was one of the things that, there we are. You can thank your own tax dollars for this. This is the single biggest public works program in human history, where the beltways and interstates that were created in 1956, the National Highway Act, this is the kind of thing that if a left-wing historian wrote it in a book, they'd accuse him of making up the facts. But the truth is that the person who was running the Federal Highway Administration at that point was a man named Francis DuPont. He happened to be the single largest stockholder in General Motors, and naturally pushed through this idea of building interstate highways. Now, this was actually the culmination of a major conspiracy that had been led by General Motors, and you can look this up. The Justice Department got a conviction in this in 1949, which is how we know all this information.
Antitrust.
Antitrust conspiracy, yeah. And it began in 1932, where GM, and by the way, moms and dads and kids, this is the story behind Who Framed Roger Rabbit. In the background, the sort of criminal, the bad guy, is building freeways. And it's based on the story of what GM, with Standard Oil and the Mack Truck Company and Firestone Rubber, they formed a front company called National City Lines, and they went all around the country, and they bought up, beginning in 1932, you got Depression-era bargain basement prices, they bought up all of the streetcar systems in 45 different cities, in all the big ones, New York, Los Angeles, Baltimore, my hometown, Chicago, would buy up all these different little companies, 100 streetcars, buy them up, shut them down, tear out the tracks.
And
that
replace
is why,
them
with cars and buses. And that is why a country like ours, which up until the 1920s, all urban commuting and travel, indeed, was done either by foot or on rail. We had a very good rail system in this country until it was destroyed by a conspiracy. And what I love is that when we did finally catch them, and the Justice Department convicted them of this conspiracy that had essentially given the car monopoly status in the biggest market in the world, right? And made these companies what is now the biggest industry in the world. Is
I bet
making
they
cars.
had to pay a heavy price.
They had to pay a terribly heavy price. It was $5,000.
No kidding.
Yeah. So
I
this
bet that
is
changed
justice.
their ways.
Yes, and now, you know, it's so, do we have to stop it? I don't know, but we certainly have to keep a much closer eye over these guys, GM, Ford, etc. Basically what we need now from an environmental standpoint, since you're asking about that, the car has to change absolutely radically, primarily because of the problem of global warming, which has begun. The UN scientists have now concluded it has started, and it's going to get much worse. And in order to have any chance in a world where we are now projected to have 1 billion cars on the planet in the year 2020, which is twice as many as we have now.
Why is the car so critical to global warming?
Because the pollution that you put out from a car, you can put a filter on there and make it not black, which is basically what we finally forced Detroit to do, starting about 25 years ago. Just like before that, we had to force them to put in seat belts. And now the car is much cleaner in that sense. However, there is no filter that can stop CO2 until you repeal the laws of chemistry. Every time you burn a carbon-based fuel like gasoline, 1 gallon sends 19 pounds of carbon up into the atmosphere. There's nothing to be done about that. And cars are growing about 4 times as fast as the human population since 1950. We had 50 million cars then, and human population has doubled. Cars have increased by 10. So there's now 500 million cars on the planet, and suddenly China wants cars, and India wants cars. And they say, you Americans have a car for every 2 people. We have a car for every 200 people. So they're going to start to get cars, and then you've got a planet with 1 billion cars on it in the year 2020. The only way to deal with that in terms of global warming is to have cars that get 5 times as good of a gas mileage.
As our current CAFE standards?
As current, yeah.
And now I understand that we're actually probably moving in the wrong direction in that regard, that with the advent of the sport utility vehicles, which fall outside of the guidelines, the requirements of the CAFE standards, which is now, what, 27.5 miles per gallon.
Yeah.
They're not required to get that, and the number of sales of these vehicles is on the rise.
They are now selling about half of what comes out of both Chrysler and Ford are now what they call either light trucks, vans, sport utility vehicles. And no, they average about 20 miles a gallon, so they pull the overall average down terribly. But look, you know, here's the really scary thing. Yes, we are moving in the wrong direction. The good news is, by the way, it is technologically feasible to build those cars that do get 150 miles a gallon. Detroit has built
With
them.
gasoline?
Yeah. Well, they're called a hybrid. They're half electric and half gasoline. You use the gasoline for what it's good for, and you use the electric for what it's good for. And some people are saying that actually you could get much more than 150, but even the companies themselves.
And where do I buy this car?
Well, that is the rub, because they aren't very interested in building this car. And that is the fundamental problem, is that these cars can be built. Renault has built them, GM has built them, VW has built them, Toyota has built them.
See, I can see why the oil industry, petroleum industry, the gasoline industry wouldn't want to see these cars sold, but I don't understand why Detroit has an interest in not selling these cars.
It's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I know the answer, but I think it does go back to that really national city lines kind of conspiracy, where these people for so long have been working together that they no longer have to call each other and say, let's be in on this together. They see their interests as being that economy, the auto culture, and so it's very hard for them to see outside of it. This is why I think what might happen is that the Europeans and the Japanese beat the American automakers to producing this car, because the industrialists there, for one thing, aren't reading the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and they know that global warming is real. So they could very well see that as a market. I hope they do, because otherwise it's very hard to see how we're going to get out of this jam, because as I say, the car does have to change. We know how to do it. It can be done if we plot it out, and we have a government program that is supposed to be doing that, but there's no money being spent on it.
What about solar cars?
Solar cars, that's a conceivable opportunity down the road, in the sense that an electric car, the advocates of electric cars, pure electric cars, say, you say to them, well, that doesn't solve the global warming problem. And they say, well, but it will, because we're going to have solar electricity. Again, you know, it's very possible technologically, but right now that is not where the capital flows are going. And in order to move that, you do have to move companies like GM. And that's where I finally come down on this, where it's hard to be hopeful, is that the people who have their hands on the controls at a time when the car has to change radically in the history of human technology, it has to change radically and quickly. The people with their hands on the controls are the same people who didn't want to put seatbelts in cars, who had to be forced for 10 years to put seatbelts in cars when you had very clear data saying 25% of our deaths are because people aren't wearing seatbelts. The same companies who said, no, we don't have to clean up smog. The same companies who have basically stopped cafe efficiency standards since Ronald Reagan. So, you know,
can you leave us with any optimistic?
I think the optimistic thing is that the Europeans and the Japanese might not be that stupid. And Detroit has been stupid for so long. You remember in the 1970s, after the first oil crisis, that's when Toyota and Honda started to get into this market, because Detroit said, oh, Americans will never buy a small car. So I hope they get their heads handed to them.
Me too. Time for us to head to the parking lot. Thanks to Mark Hertsgaard for joining us here on Coffee House Forum. So until September, and even thereafter, I'm Mark Cohen for Tacoma Coffee House.